Yeah.
Cool. Whenever you're ready.
Cool. So I'm debating through my phone. So if anyone could confirm that this position is all right and you can hear me loud and clear.
Yes, can hear you.
Cool, great. Let me just set up my individual timer. I'll just start in a couple of seconds. Timer. Go. Cool. All right. Starting in 3, 2, 1. I doubt for after a month when people have been protesting and crying about the fact that they don't have access to enough food and that they don't have access to medical care and that their living costs are far too high. And post these concessions of protest, the government consented and concessioned them and compensated with this to reduce and subsidize the cost of fuel pricing. That these people with the reduced and subsidized fuel pricing are just randomly going to wake up one day and think their problems are solved. They realize with the ability of all of the living costs have significantly increased despite the fuel pricing being subsidized, that their living costs have increased massively. That makes their lives harder. I don't think people are just going to forget that there's a fucking inflation in their country just because your government chooses to subsidize one segment of their economy in a large instance. I don't think opposition is having to support massive amounts of inflation and having to support the subsidy for years of period on end. But this is necessarily about it's okay to subsidize this sort of fossil fuel if it means that you're able to fluctuate your economy, and if it means that even if a significant GDP of your nation has to be contributed into sort of providing these subsidies, it's okay. There's a couple of reasons for this, so let's start with reason number 1. The dependency on these fossil fuels. Note that Latin America isn't so far a developed country, which means their access to green technology, their access to sort of developing around things that don't require fossil fuels is not the thing that exists, right? So a large chunk of their development, including things like electricity, including things like businesses, are all circulated and very, very heavily connected with the development of fossil fuels. That is to say that they require the churning of fossil fuels and coal burning to be able to generate electricity, to be able to generate food as well, right? Because note that the electricity and the gas that you use in your stove also comes from being able to burn these fossil fuels that you means you'll be able to cook at home. Note, a large chunk of their economy is also fluctuated by restaurant owners, by people that also supply tourism. This also means that electricity supply is uniquely important to these people, but also being able to cook their meals to make sure that they're able to support themselves. What then would be otherwise the alternative for governments is to be able to reduce these living costs and other mechanisms that looks like being able to provide these people with subsidized medical care, subsidized food shortages, and trying to make sure that food supplies are cheaper for them. Instead of doing all of these things, they chose strategically to subsidize the one thing that governs all of these mechanisms, right? Because not only is it important to provide people with food, but it's also important to provide people with the ability to continue to their jobs as much as they can. Because insofar as they're lacking the ability to do their jobs, they're going to have less money within their hands. They're going to have less ability to purchase anything that is being sold in the market. But that also means that governments have to subsidize other things far more for these people. So ability to continue to sustain yourself in terms of getting some daily wages is crucial and important weighing in this debate. We then need to show you in this debate two things. One, how is this sort of subsidizing of fossil fuels necessary in terms of creating this fluctuation of economy? But second, why the other alternative simply just stuck in this scenario, right? I don't think you can run general sort of alternatives in this debate when this is specifically about Latin America. So I think it's really important to understand the economy of Latin America in the first place. Note, since it's not a developed country and since they lack this high amount of financial understanding and financial successes, they don't necessarily have central banks that have a large amount of liquidity. So increasing the interest of maybe higher interest rates makes the markets far more volatile because the investor confidence in terms of being able to invest within those markets reduces. When you have higher interest rates and when your currency is also low, the ability to invest in that market reduces because you're not quite sure what are the kind of returns you'll be getting on that investment. But significantly, it's also probably good to keep that interest rate minimal, but it's also probably good to utilize that inflation to your best opportunities, right? Because insofar as they don't have the financial literacy to use other mechanisms in their country, use other means of things, it then becomes important to start to fluctuate the subsidies that you can have within these fossil fuels. How does this then work, right? So insofar as you're able to subsidize these fossil fuels, you're able to achieve two things. One, people are able to make sure that they're able to cook at their homes, they're able to provide for food, they're able to get their like daily meals into their head, like into their bodies. But secondly, it also ensures that people that run businesses and restaurants are able to do this. Secondly, electricity supply, because like Latin America does get hot, it becomes important, so people are not dying of like heat problems and all these kind of things. But thirdly, and more importantly, insofar as you supply these fossil fuels, it becomes important to understand that these are probably the ones at the highest rate increase right now because of the Russia-Ukraine sort of conflict that increases the fuel pricing in these nations at large. I don't think this necessarily has to look like long-term issues of like subsidizing for maybe 3 or 4 years on end. And here's why, right? Because insofar as you're able to subsidize the one thing that governs a large chunk of businesses within the country, you're able to ensure that there's some liquidity that continues to happen. This liquidity is able to fluctuate the economy and push more money into the economy. How does this then work, right? Because inflation necessarily means that your currency value is also incredibly low. It also means that the kind of money in your infrastructure is also incredibly low. But when your like currency is specifically low, the stocks sold in your own currency also mean they're cheaper to purchase. So a lot more foreign investment can specifically happen in countries where they're like currency value is significantly low. That's why like that's like one way of like getting inflation to go away, right? So you get like more amount of investment that happens from foreign countries that still want to invest in your countries and your stocks and what kind of exports you have. Because note, Latin America is largely a country that succeeds based on tourism, that it succeeds based on like the ability to generate these exports and get them sold. So they're probably going to be able to sell them more when they still exist at lower prices instead of government's alternative where you increase the interest rates, where you increase the kind of prices that they exist at, which means less investors want to buy the kind of exports that you're selling them. What is the second kind of analysis that you get from side opposition? Second thing, I think considering that largely bad mechanisms of financial schemes and policies have existed in the past, I'm not so sure what kind of presidents Latin America has, insofar as they're generally a right-wing economy, but largely they've had presidents and like rulers that don't really make good economic policies. Take, for example, Venezuela, take, for example, like large chunk of Argentinian economy also failing on its head, right? What then it means is that it's crucially important to get the money flowing, because the minute that you're able to create this liquidity, that shows that like you can still have some form of like fluctuations to the economy. This allows uniquely for the economy to regenerate itself, because insofar as people are literally saving their money, people are literally like not spending money at all, even if it doesn't sort of increase inflation. What it causes a problem is that the government doesn't have enough money to continue to supply these subsidies to you. So what is crucially important is that the government is able to get some money so they can sustain that these people and supply them with the current use of demand of like trying to ensure that their living costs reduce. So the overall consideration in this debate is considering that there's a large chunk of inflation and people don't have massive money in their hands and they have to sustain with high living costs. How are you best going to reduce these living costs? You have certain mechanisms available to your end. You can probably provide them with more number of jobs. Given that this is less likely to happen because the number of jobs are currently saturated in the market right now, the best thing that you can go ahead with is subsidize the massive costs that they have to endure. More than medical care costs, more than food care costs and all of these things, the current highest cost for these consumers in like Latin American countries like Panama, like Ecuador, and all of these things is largely to let me show you why this is probably a good thing to do, and we probably reduce the inflation coming.
Hi, sorry, I think the last couple of seconds of your speech cut out a bit, but it was also after 8 minutes. So are you okay with us moving on?
Yeah, I'm fine, I guess. It's okay.
You can give your outro if you'd like.
Okay, cool. Okay, cool. Resuming in 3, 2, 1. Considering that government necessarily had to explain what alternatives likely exist, and given that these people have largely been suffering with high living costs, you had to necessarily show what is something you can reduce. So far, you can't increase these interest rate, because that means it's still going to mean higher costs for people, and you still need to get money into the system so that governments can have money to themselves, that they can continue to provide for these people and help them in the terms of need. It then means that you try to reduce the cost of the thing that affects them the most. Given that fossil fuel prices are like impacting these people the most, it only then makes sense to try to reduce them as much as possible, reduce the overall living cost for these people, and make their lives a little bit easier. Couldn't be more proud to oppose.
Awesome. I thank the speaker for that speech, and I call upon the second speaker from side affirming.
Hi, am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Oh, I'll start my speech in 3, 2, 1. The biggest argument from negative is that people need to survive. They've been protesting on the street and we need to appease them. First response, we couldn't let government make convenient policies that makes them look good in the short term because subsidy is populist, right? It's a short-term relief. It's what makes people appease you. And government term, like governor's term, are usually 5 years ish, so it looks good. That's an easy way to stop protests. But as government, we do think that the kind of decision that you make need to be in the long term. They challenge our characterization, saying that high price is unlikely to, stay for a long time. But here's the thing, high price is going to be there for a long time for three structural reasons. First, the war that happened between Russia and Ukraine, although they say that it's unlikely to stay like that for a long time, we do say that it's reaching a stalemate, right? I mean, Russia has its own backups and the Ukraine also has its own backups. But even if war doesn't happen for a long time, we see precedents of OPEC plus, like the organizations that manage oil, they do manipulation of prices. They take advantage of what's happening right now, and therefore you couldn't also rely on them as an actor that would make international price of oil become stable as time goes. But the third reason is also things like limited resources, that prices like this, they're bound to happen to increase when even in Middle Eastern countries, the resources are getting limited, and that's why they increase the price because they need to make ends meet or whatever. Therefore, we need to do that. We think we still challenge it back, and we do believe that it's going to be something that is long term. Second rebuttal, negatives say that people will still understand inflation happens since you only subsidize one sector. Therefore, inflation, can still be felt to some extent and people wouldn't forget. First, if they claim that when you subsidize one thing, it doesn't mean that people will completely forget because they would still feel inflation to some extent, then it also decrease their benefits, right? Because then what they are saying, what negative saying is that if you subsidize fossil fuels, then all cost of living will automatically decrease because of the trickle-down effect. Therefore, it's not a strategic claim they make. But second response, I do think that people tend to forget this. Why is this the case? Because people's financial decisions are made based on future of prediction of what the future looks like, right? When you go to the supermarket and you see that the costs are still the same, you see that, yeah, probably there's a problem, but government is doing enough. Therefore, the behavior change society has to take is on the individual level. That's why we need to allow government to give clear signal to the people as to what's the condition of the economy. Third response, even if people do realize that the economy don't change, or even though the source is limited, I think that's when you have things like hoarding behaviors, right? Because they do understand, oh, there is scarcity, but they also know that the government is currently subsidizing it. Therefore, they will take advantage of it. And you cannot say that it is unlikely because that's what happened even during, pandemic, for example. So this kind of mechanism is likely to bring even more harms when people see that government is pouring money into it and they see that it won't be forever like that. Therefore, they feel like I have to take advantage now and then sell it again later. And so people's buying behavior then something that will be worse on negative side of the house. Third rebuttal, they say that green technology can't be default because Latin America don't have the resources to do that. First, I think just because it doesn't exist right now, it doesn't mean that we should just accept that. It even shows more urgency why we need to start the shift now, because the earlier it is, the better it is. But okay, second response, right? Let's play in their context that they simply don't have the technology. I think in this case, then what will happen is that we need to make rations out of it. That because if we don't have the resources, that means what's likely for this Latin America is that they import most of their fossil fuels, that they don't make it themselves because they don't have the resources, right? Therefore, what you need to do is actually ration it out. You cannot encourage your people to buy it over and over again, and for them to not like ration it out because they think that the situation is not getting any worse. Within on negative side of the house, it's also a burden that they have to take. What then they are going to do? Um, Fourth rebuttal, they say that banks don't have liquidity, therefore market will be volatile. I think first untrue. The prerequisite for market to be volatile is when people don't know what to expect. But when you create a monetary policy, that's when you send a clear message about the future. And we think market will slow down. We do consider that businesses will slow down, but it's not the same as being volatile. Second rebuttal, if they want to talk about investment, you need to actually, pay it back. It's not just free money. You need to pay the interest you have to pay investment with interest. When the stability that you glorify on your side of the house is created because it is false, like it's manufactured, right? You subsidize things to an extreme degree to the point that, I mean, this is billions of money. It's 1% of your GDP. It's unlikely that I think investor will want to come because they will see that this is not actually, a natural growth, but it's an artificial one. Therefore, on their side of the house, it's going to be worse. Going to my extension then, now that it's all over, I'll tell you first then how this is why temporary solution is not ideal. When you give a massive subsidy like this, what will happen is massive spending, right? You're making your citizen think that the fuels are going to be there forever at that low price. It's like putting a bandage over a bullet wound. Why? It might look ideal in the short term because you keep the rising prices at bay, but it was an illusion, right? Because that means if there were no subsidy, then the price would have skyrocketed. Latin American countries are yes, most of them are developing countries. When you try so hard to keep the subsidy going on for years, I think putting your money on out like this is not strategic for the country. You will be drawn in debt in no time, and that's bad because when you try to implement subsidy to the point that you accumulate debt, that's when the government is spending so much and earning so little. Therefore, when it finally catches up to these Latin American countries, you will choke your economy. You will probably go from inflation, let's say 4%, because you keep raising prices at bay, right? And then you can't subsidize it anymore, and the inflation catches up to 30%. That's because when you subsidize, these two things happen, which is that the price of fuel keep increasing, but also your own economy grow way too fast, uncontrollable from borrowed money. That's why in the future it will be worse. Why on our sets will it will work? When we increase interest rates, that's a form of monetary policy. What people do is that they are not going to take that mortgage of a house they've been eyeing. They don't take loan to get that car they want because the mortgage will have higher interest. They will have to pay more. So instead, people put their money in the bank because it's seen as a good financial decision. You get more money from that. We think this kind of thing is actually saving your citizen. Why? Because if anything, what citizen deserve from their government is to allow them to make decision making according to the current context. They need to know that taking a mortgage for that house right now is not wise because we're actually in a bad economic condition. On negative side, you will manipulate your people into thinking that no inflation is happening. So we characterize to you that most likely it will be worse in the long term, right? That means when you finally cannot subsidize it, these citizens will already take commitment to pay mortgage, will already make decisions to take a loan and open a new business because you made them think the growth of the economy is totally healthy. You doom your citizens to even more debt on their side of the house. So don't believe all their narrative about saving the citizen because it's actually just a bandage over a bullet wound. It's a temporary solution that will make it worse off in the long term. You are not solving the inflation. You are making people believe that it won't happen, but it will catch up to you. That's why the right way to solve this is actually to slow down the economy and allow the invisible hand of the economy to be able to fix itself when you allow it to take a breather and the circulation of money isn't that fast. Proud to propose.
Awesome. I thank the speaker for that speech, and I call upon the second speaker from side negative.
Yep. Am I audible? Loud and clear?
Yes, you are.
Great. I'll start in 3, 2, 1. Before I get into engaging with them, let me be very clear. The metric of this debate has to be about the short term, or it can be about the long term as well. We'll prove to you that if you don't protect your economy in the fucking short term, there is no long term for you to protect. Why this is likely to be important. What I will do in my speech is prove to you that short-term protection is extremely vital, and their counterfactual necessarily fucks up the people in the short term, but the long-term impacts are also extremely, extremely problematic. Short term then. Note your whole goddamn economy is dependent upon this. You're in a developing country and you're necessarily in a country where you necessarily have to export things. Means that this is manufacturing industry. You have to make chemicals for your agriculture economy. That makes pesticides. You necessarily need electricity to do everything else. All of those means that the cost of the inflation in which the fossil fuels have risen to necessarily makes this economies extremely bad. Your foundation of your economy itself. Insofar you do not protect them on the short term, what happens then? People lose jobs in terms of tremendous amount of layoffs at a point at which you cannot protect these kind of jobs because you cannot afford to hire these people. But more importantly, the moment cost increases, companies necessarily cannot compete in the global supply chain, right? Notice how European Union is already putting price caps in terms of fossil fuels. United States of America, which is necessarily affected by the same idea, is using its own reserve foils. Countries like India, China necessarily still have access to the Russian market. The China itself is selling oil to African countries and India as well. You get outcompeted by every goddamn country which is there in the short term in the next 6 months to 1 year. Why this is harmful? A, people lose livelihoods in terms of they are not able to afford these livelihood things, but more importantly, your industries necessarily fail because they do not have any sort of money to protect themselves. Notice this is Latin America, where these industries are necessarily not established from last 20 to 30 years. These are nascent, mid-sized industry competing in a global supply chain market. All of those means that they get outcompeted and necessarily file things like bankruptcy at a point where they're losing money at a faster rate because there's nothing else which is trying to protect them. Because even if I buy everything which they're saying in terms of decreasing the amount of interest rate, making sure that the money is not circulating in the market, all of those happen on the long term. You necessarily need your bank to necessarily do this. The effects of that takes at least 6 months to a year to happen. Subsidy is quicker. If you give subsidy today, you can do it tomorrow. I think at that point of time, you necessarily have to weigh the short term over the long term. But why their argument about long term necessarily do not work? Let's shit on their alternatives. A, central banks, multitudes of harms for this. A, central banks in Latin America country necessarily do not know how to do this. Notice how Venezuela happened its own inflation at a point where it started printing its money. But more importantly, central banks in Latin America countries are directly dependent upon their own governments. These governments are more often than not corrupt, right? We are not trying to be smart in terms of calling Latin America stupid, but that is what the reality is. Brazilian economy is dependent upon things like what Bolsonaro does. All of those this necessarily means that they are necessarily connected by an extremely corrupt government, extremely unsure how the central government can work. But secondly, and more importantly, central government necessarily cannot buy bonds which are necessarily created by the government itself, because these bonds are extremely highly interested and high yield bonds because of the fact that there is no trust in the market to support Latin American bonds at a point at which Venezuelan and Bolivian bonds have necessarily failed for the longest period of time. Means that the central economy necessarily cannot create this money. But thirdly, and more importantly, the moment central banks necessarily do that, it makes the market more volatile, which brings me back to my first argument about this industry itself, right? These companies which are necessarily nascent, necessarily need this market to be stable at a point at which people need to trust and be optimistic, right? The moment you start pulling out of the Latin American financial markets, this directly affects the Latin American companies, which are extremely important and the cornerstone of the Latin America economy in the first place. These markets get extremely volatile. These companies become extremely weaker. This means that on your long term, even if you're able to protect their economy, the companies which necessarily make your economy as a whole and contribute maximum to your GDP are extremely weaker because you made the financial markets volatile in the first place. Because the moment you increase the interest rate, people do not know how long and how much time would it be. It makes the market more and more unstable. Why you cannot do any other thing rather than doing this, right? I'll just go through them very quickly, even though government doesn't really talk about this. One, you cannot depend upon government because A, as I talked about, governments are corrupt, but B, the other alternative solution governments have is necessarily lesser infrastructure spending. That's bad because the moment they will necessarily do this won't affect rich people because rich people necessarily lobby these kind of governments. Extreme right-wing governments in Argentina, Peru, and Brazil, the example like Bolsonaro, which means that this money would necessarily go away from things like infrastructure development of healthcare, education, and so on. In a country like developing Brazilian economy and so on, these are extremely important considering the amount of gaps they have in terms of education, in terms of income, and so on, right? Which means that this money directly goes away from extremely vulnerable actors. We think that alternative necessarily sucks. I think all of those alternatives, which are again the solution of what else can we do, are extremely bad for all of the reasons, but also more particularly, we do not know what the heck Latin American governments would do. They have been historically poor at economics. I think at that point of time, we cannot really trust that the long-term idea would be sustainable. But more importantly, right, why this fuel crisis is necessarily not something which falls in the debate, why this is not likely to be continued. There are multiple responses to this. First, let's assume two scenarios, right? Firstly, we think that like war is not going to a stalemate, Ukraine is winning, but just the same reason that Russia is necessarily losing more and more land every single time. The amount of aid which is coming from countries like United States of America, EU, and the Latin America again necessarily means that Ukraine just have a war chest amount of money to fight off Russia. At the same point of time, Russia is losing money because of the fact that COVID necessarily fucked up their economy. Their war chest is extremely not large, but also more importantly, the only thing which they sell and get most amount of money from is oil, and they have switched off the pipes going to switched off North stock pipes and everything else, which means that they are not getting that money as well, which means that at some point of time Russia will run out. So this works in both ways. If the war subsidizes and the war gets over, like this fuel crisis goes away. But if the war continues and it's a stalemate, like Russia has to make sure that they're selling oil again because of the fact that Russia needs money and needs the war chest to continue the stalemate. If like what government is saying is true, for both of the scenario, we stand to win because either Russia is selling oil or the war is over. In both of the scenarios, this fuel crisis is gone. But secondly, like even if you do not buy that, four more responses, right? Like more importantly, look at what Europe is doing. Europe is trying to sign now deals with countries like Saudi Arabia and Qatar. Extremely unsure why Latin America can't sign those deals as well. At a point of which Qatar and Saudi Arabia get more clients to sell oil. But secondly, and more importantly, China insofar has BRI ambitions and necessarily has connections with Latin America, necessarily means that they use their own oil fields to help Latin American countries at the time of need. But thirdly, and more importantly, right, America's own oil reserves necessarily means that they can sell some of this oil to Latin America. They would do this to counter Chinese influence in those kind of regions. For all of those reasons mean that these deals would probably take like a long time, but more importantly, this crisis itself, it would not continue for the longest period of time. But even if all of that, what you believe is untrue, you have to look how you necessarily want to weigh this debate. We think on a short term, the harm is huge, right? Which is to say, your companies fall down because they get out-competed in a global market. But more importantly, people are affected. People on the ground, which is say that these people who necessarily are getting laid off, the people who necessarily cannot afford their day-to-day expenses, all of those expenses go away. But secondly, and more importantly, like two things here. One, when you're spending 1% of GDP, two things happen. This is not a huge amount of money, which means that you have 99% of your GDP left to invest in different things, which means that they cannot make that argument. You are making a substantial kind of a subsidy. We think 1 GDP is absolutely fine. But secondly, and more importantly, if it's important, you have to explain why you're fucking investing like $1 billion in subsidies, right? You necessarily cannot hide this fact from people because people will generally go and buy petrol. People will be in the industries and buy petrol and realize that all of this is fucking subsidized. I think at that point of time, when government has to justify why it is, and then governments tell that there's a fucking inflation, I think people would be aware and make sure to do whatever on their end to not buy a new house, to not buy new products. That remains. So you have to weigh this debate in terms of short term because we must protect this industry on short term because most vulnerable people get affected, but also more importantly, industries you necessarily need to protect who will not exist if you don't do this. Could not be more proud to.
Awesome. I thank speaker for that speech, and I call upon the third speaker from side affirmative.
Hello, am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Give me a moment to tidy my notes. Okay. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Two clashes in my speech. First, on fulfilling the goal to combat inflation, and second of all, how it would look like on the long term. Everything will be integrated. First clash, right? Who is actually fulfilling the goal to combat inflation? Because if we tell you the impact caused by this massive subsidy actually causes harms that outweighs the benefits and worsens the inflation, it justifies why we are regretting this method, right? For engagements towards negative bench, right? First of all, they tell you without massive subsidy, living costs will be much more expensive. Yeah, that is literally the definition of inflation. We've already bitten the bullet. Why? This is something society needs to realize because inherently inflation is best solved when people stop spending money on all of the unnecessary things, right? This is very important. We have already characterized this from the very beginning that people also need to change their consuming behavior to actually minimize it so that companies do not get overconfident with their price raises. This is actually what makes the inflation stop down. So yeah, even with the biggest harm that people living costs becomes more expensive, which is something people necessarily need to realize and change their behavior. We've already taken that, right? Second, engagement. They tell you lower cost means that it invites foreign investors and tourism. This is their biggest case, talking about the benefits of this massive subsidy, right? Two responses, however, then first of all, this benefit does not make sense because they themselves tells you investors and tourism are interested because of the low value of currency, and that's why people will invest there, right? So the huge benefit glorified by the negative bench isn't caused by the massive subsidy, but caused by the inflation itself, right? That is why inherently their resolution does not even support their stance, does not justify why this massive subsidy is necessary. Notice how none of their speeches actually emphasize what the massive subsidy, even though my first affirmative has already told you this is a lot of money that you're investing into this, and they never explain why the subsidy has to be to the extent of massive. We tell you we're highlighting this right now, right? But second response, we told you why relying on foreign parties doesn't combat tourism, doesn't combat inflation even more, right? If in anything, it gives Latin America more capital, which results into two harms that is exclusive on their side of the house. First of all, giving government more money just to buy more fuel doesn't solve the problem because the source of inflation within this debate, this is not just any normal inflation, but this is inflation caused by the limited fuel, right? So when Latin America has limited resource and they buy even more fuel, this is just adding to the exact problem, not solving the inflation, not solving the case by actually changing the people's behavior and limiting the amount of fuel they actually consume, right? Because notice the reserve coming from Russia and Ukraine is not necessarily a reliable source, right? But second of all, even giving the citizens more capital within this kind of situation means that they are buying into existing prices marked up by companies. It reduces the incentive for companies to reduce their prices, and this just solidifies and manifests inflation on their side of the house. So we tell you, right, the resolution coming from negative side of the house that is A, either not exclusive, or B, does not actually help the combat of inflation. Second point down, right? Third point, negative tells you that if we do not subsidize if we do not do this massive subsidy, it's gonna hamper small business. This is symmetrical on either side. Even when on your side you massively subsidize fossil fuels, richer companies still can buy more of the fuel. This point doesn't stand. Third point out, right? Fourth point. Lastly, and most important engagement, notice that all of their points fall when we also agree that fuel is a necessity, right? That fuel for basic needs such as to run electrical companies, to give heat, etc., should be subsidized. So what is the delta from either side from both affirmative and negative? The burden in negative that they fail to answer why the subsidy has to be significant subsidy, right? You cannot say that 1% is a small amount of money. 1% is huge. That is billions of dollars of literally how much worth that Latin America has, as per mentioned in the context slide, as per mentioned by my first affirmative. So when the entirety of negative is just defending subsidy, that is not their case. Their case is to actually explain to you why it has to be significant. That's why we think this is very important to highlight. Why? In the end of the day, affirmative is able to tell you why we regret this. We take the first clash, right? Second clash on how it looks like in the long term. You need to understand the consensus of this debate is that the cost of inflation isn't in the hands of Latin America, but an external party, which is Russia's invasion to Ukraine. So this is why the first engagement to negative makes so much sense, right? Because they come in this second neg come in this debate telling you this debate is about short term. No, putting so much government's money into solving the problem now, even though we told you why it's so harmful in the long term, is exactly why it's such a dangerous move to make. It is it is unforeseeable how the future will look like, and taking too much of your money to put in this, even though there's so many other things you could look for or save up the GDP for. This is exactly why when second negative says it will be quicker, yeah, it'll be quicker to solve the problem now, but it's gonna bubble up and gonna be much worse later on when the fuel is, for an example, more expensive and everything, right? But yeah, even if the economy doesn't survive, they tell you economy doesn't survive now, people cannot survive long term, we'll engage into that. That is the whole point of the problem existing. It's not because of it is actually because of the inflation, right? The reason why economy is struggling is because of the inflation. That's necessarily why this debate looks like this, right? But massive subsidy is not the only solution to overcome the inflation. This is why their side is just defending a correlation case, because because if they say that the problem is solving the economy now, it is not exclusively solved by massive subsidy. On our side, we told you why the debate is not about combating inflation, because both sides want to do that. But first of all, we told you you the method of massive subsidy is so harmful because you use up so many economic resources so quick, as well as fuel resources from the fossil fuel. But second of all, if our GDP decreases even more because of this massive subsidy, because reducing by 1% again and again every year means that it makes the inflation much worse, right? This also directly engages with negatives argument about investors wanting to invest inside Latin America. This is not going to happen because investors look at the GDP of countries, and if our GDP is actually lower and keeps getting lower because on their side they want to continually sustain this massive subsidy, this is actually what's going to make investors opt out and to want to go away, right? So when negative assumes people will die because of this inflation, the simple way to frame up this harm is that people will survive the short term in this current state. That fuel is expensive, but let alternatives exist. Because when we slow down the economy, it does not mean that the economy doesn't run at all. You still have companies sending their products, but probably not as much. People still purchase their primary needs, but wouldn't go and buy their, like decorative or fun needs and everything. So when we have already proven to you that all of the bad things said by negative about how we're going to go bankrupt is wrong, we think we keep economy at a minimum level. That is why the harm that they said that people will die is not existent on our side, and that is why we've already solved the problem at a much better rate, right? That's why the best case scenario in negative side is that if the massive subsidy continues growing and fuel runs out, that is why the further inflation down the road is going to be much bigger than the one that can mitigate. This has come up in the second affirmative, has never been responded. We think it's too late now for them to be responded, right? Lastly, and most importantly, the war is so unreliable. So it's so out of this debate when second negative tried to defend the war in Russia and how it will end soon. The only factual thing in this debate is unclear where it goes, right? So we tell you two alternatives. First of all, if the war does goes on, we tell you that exactly justifies our regret that we need to actually save the fossil fuel reserve. And this method that the Latin America is doing is just wasting up the fossil fuel reserve. That is why this massive subsidy is harmful. But even if the war ends tomorrow, we tell you that the fact that the GDP of Latin America is actually minimized, 1% of GDP is a lot. This is why it's still doing so much harm. We're proud to regret. Thank you.
Awesome. I thank speak for that speech, and I call upon the third speaker from side negative.
Hello, am I visible and audible?
Yes, you are.
Cool. Give me 2 seconds and I'll start. Starting in 3, 2, 1. First thing to deal with here is the counterfactual we get from graph. I don't really think they actually build one in the sense that they say stuff but don't mechanize how the counterfactual actually plays out. Their solution here is to get some sort of sustainable development. The way they say they'll do this is to decrease the supply of money in the economic system. And when they do this, people get alarmed of the situation. I don't think poor people dependent on filling their car with petrol in order to get to their 9 to 5 job so they can put food on the table for their family would like to be alarmed this way. People already know the situation is bad globally. They can see the war going on. They're already alarmed. People can tell when they're in bad economic conditions overall as a state. If I see, like literally in India, if the cost of, say, onions goes up by 20%, everyone knows there's a huge problem. If I see onions are going to be much more expensive, I'm not going to go out and buy luxury goods. I don't know why people are stupid in our world, but let's take them at their best. Let's assume this is the sort of tipping point that gets people alarmed and gets them to want to make change. I don't see how creating panic and hoping for some sort of reactionist mechanism is good. Gov never mechanized how this is likely to play out on their side. If anything, given the historical precedents for governments being overthrown by radical right-wing and left-wing parties in South America, what is likely to happen is for things like revolutions occurring. This is more so true given the premise for these revolutions occurring was that the basic needs were way too expensive for people to purchase. These issues inherently further stagnate the economy further and screw over people who are most desperately in need of resources. But regardless, implementing monetary policy the way Gov is saying by just decreasing the supply of money via the central bank is not that easy. We give you so many reasons for this. You drastically decrease the amount of money available to people to spend on their needs. You make it more difficult to buy everything, but also from an investment perspective, since the cost of investing in the country is also likely to increase, investors will probably not increase considering the risk averse nature that most investors hold, but also the fact that you're implementing reactionary policies as a bank. This inherently decreases investor confidence in the market because you're creating more uncertainty surrounding the economic trajectory the country is trying to follow. What then plays out is this form of stagflation. Inflation is still going to occur. Investment is going to keep going down, making it more and more difficult to sort of combat any further inflation. All this does is causes more unemployment, further making life shittier for poor people. Let me be clear. At no point in this debate do we claim that all of these problems get immediately solved on our side. The important thing here is the comparative. What we do is at least make sure the economy doesn't tank right now. Make sure that investors are more likely to invest in these countries because the country's policies to make fuels cheaper for consumers is seen as a move intended to attract foreign investment in the world, because it's clear that the government is trying to solve the problems in the country, trying to help out people who are vulnerable. Next, I don't think status quo is that you will subsidize indefinitely. If the reason for subsidies is, as App says, the war between Russia and Ukraine, it's unlikely that it plays out indefinitely. Like, I agree with GovWhip here. We don't know what's going to happen. But what we do know is that it's going to reach a conclusion over time. But in the time until that, since the supply of petrol has decreased globally, which has caused an increase in prices overall, we need to find a way to deal with this. The only way to do this is via subsidies that make these things more accessible. Over time, while alternative sources such as, say, importing from other countries such as the US become the more and more dominant supply, and this increases the net supply and prices go down, like, we can just slowly decrease the subsidy. Like, if the prices of oil are decreasing and becoming stable, we can just gradually remove the scale of the subsidy. The whole policy of subsidizing is based on understanding the global supply and demand and finding out what rates people in your country can afford. If rates go down in substantially, we can just get rid of it. Since that hasn't happened yet, the subsidy is still something that we need to exist right now. And note, the subsidy needs to be significant because the price is very, very high right now due to the reasons that Gov gives you, and we need to make this affordable for people in the now. So what does this look like, right, in terms of framing? What is the situation in terms of dependence on fossil fuels? I think the first thing here is the urgency of problems. What Gov says here is that subsidies are populist. Okay, I don't mean to be the woke call out here, but why is populist bad? These countries do have the burden to look after their people. The politicians and people in power do have an obligation to try to ease the burden on people. If making fossil fuels accessible will make it so that people can go to their daily jobs, so that they can find it easier to put food on the table, it's literally a justified decision for the government to take. Like, I don't know why being populist makes you a horrible person in all instances. But Gov says that governments have to only be long-termist in nature, right? We have to think about what's going to happen in the future. That is ridiculous. Governments have to consider long-term consequences while also dealing with drastic short-term changes. If that's the case, you should never try to do something like, say, quantitative easing, because it increases the money supply because you need it now, but it doesn't necessarily consider what's going to happen 20 years in the future as a result of this. Literally, any economic policy is based on making changes in the now. If the future is so unforeseeable, I don't see how long-term investment works or matters. If you have no clue about what is happening, how can you implement policies that are long-termist? Gov just says long-term policies. They don't explain what these look like at all. But what does this look like in general, right? There's a huge dependence on this economy when it comes to petroleum. Lots of jobs are dependent on this. They say for small businesses, everything is symmetric. They don't say why. When prices become drastically high for petrol, only big players are going to be able to afford it. And this is what's going to happen in the absence of a subsidy, which means that they are the ones who disproportionately have a higher probability of survival. Small businesses can't afford it. And the reasoning behind this is because the subsidy is significant. So it's cutting prices down a lot, which is why smaller businesses can afford it. Literally all of DLO's mechanisms as to why this becomes much, much worse on their side still stand. Like, I don't see how this is symmetric. That isn't a good response at all. Small players get completely screwed over as a result of this. Gov says these countries have a history of default and a reputation of default. I think the first response here is, okay, let's say they default on our side. How much worse can the reputation get? Gov never actually shows the comparative scale increase. But second, and more importantly, if businesses can't function because petrol is now expensive, making it more difficult to transport goods also ends up decreasing the net amount of resources or net amount of money that your country is generating as well. That also means you're going to get less tax money. That also means the probability of default increases. Again, I don't necessarily see a delta on their side. What's the weighing in terms of economics? economics. People pull out of financial markets. Inflation, you increase the cost of living in the absence of the mechanism that exists to combat the rising inflation. So what's the macro problem? When it occurs at such drastic rates, the purchasing power parity in your country decreases. What this means is that the value of your country's exports relatively decrease, while conversely the cost of importing ends up increasing. It's not bad in general, but it's much worse in the context of these Latin American countries for the reasons you get down opposition bench, because there's a huge dependence on these exports being valuable. Again, if there's already less development of industries, there's less dependent, there's a large dependence of transport and of goods within these regions. Like at that point, I don't really see why this is increasing the cost of imports that way is good. I think the trade-off is this, in just purely economic terms, is this: we increase the fiscal deficit of the country when we subsidize these fuels in status quo. The justification to increase the fiscal deficit is one of two following criteria must be met. A, the spending of money this way is going to decrease general disparity, or B, you need that financial stimulus at the moment in time in order to make sure the economy does not tank. We fulfill both these criteria for the reasons you get down our bench. The fact that there is an urgent need because the entire economy is dependent on this. The fact that if the cost keeps on going up, the output by the existing underdeveloped industries will keep going down. The fact that cost of living has increased substantially and it's going to get more and more difficult for people to get their needs. This deals with the economics of a whole, but more importantly, note the comparative here. The counterfactual that we get from Gov just doesn't work. The reasoning behind that is they don't prove that they successfully combat inflation. They just say monetary policy. If it was that easy to solve economic crisis, then literally no country in history would ever face an economic crisis. Gov had to mechanize how this central bank should operate and explain how monetary policy will actually play out. They can't just fiat the model. But in terms of social repercussions, right, what's most important here is what's happening in the now. If lots of people are dependent on this, in order for long-term solvency to matter, you have to be able to manage short-term liquidity. You have to make sure people living in the now actually have a future. I don't see how alerting people of the situation matters here at all. For the reasons we've given you, they already know it's a crisis. Making them panic more is bad. Literally look at what happened during the first wave of the COVID pandemic across the world. People started hoarding resources without thinking about the future because they were scared and only cared about short-term sustenance. Business in these countries all of a sudden starts to lose more and more money. More and more people keep getting unemployed. Causes a huge financial burden on the government where they have to pay much more for things like social security in order to make it easier for people to put food on the table, which means the government is going to spend a lot of money anyways. If we can keep people employed in our world, if we can keep the economy developing in our world, then that's a benefit in and of itself. We win this debate.
Awesome. I thank Speaker for that speech, and I'll reverse the order. So I call upon the leader of the negative team to conclude their case.
Yep. Am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Great. I'll start in 3, 2, 1. Panel, the back and forth is extremely fucked up in this debate, because let's deal with everything they have said in this debate, right? One, they're counterfactual. Their counterfactual is necessarily ancient at first half, which is to say that we'll make sure that we are doing this via central half, so like central bank, and this is explained for like 40 seconds, and this is 20 seconds in second half, no engagement in third half, right? We think the problem with that is that if you don't have a counterfactual in this debate and you are regretting an economic crisis, this means that you do not have mechanization to explain how exactly you're getting rid of the inflation, which you even agree is the problem. What do we tell is the problem with central bank? Multitudes of things. A, these people necessarily cannot do things like selling of government bonds, because these bonds are extremely hard to sell, because these belong to Latin American countries which have extremely fluctuating economies and have not been good with their bonds. Example Bolivia, example Venezuela, example Peru. I think all of those reasons mean that they cannot do that. Secondly, and more importantly, like increasing interest rates is great, but this is tremendously long term. The effect of increasing our interest rate necessarily feels the economy after 6 to 8 months. I think the damage is done. We will explain that in a bit. But also more importantly, the problem with central banks then becomes that the market will become extremely volatile, right? Which is to say, people panic in terms of not trusting the economy, they pull out on the economies and so on. Like notice the predictions about recession globally, right? Just not care about Latin America. We think that they cannot just argue against empirical facts. I think like as an average reasonable voter, you have to consider what exactly is going on in the world right now. I think it's fair to assume that there is a recession impending because of higher interest rate. I think the similar things will happen in Latin America. The difference is that unlike United States of America, you would not have like options to do things like quantitative easing. You would not have options to do things like clearing out debt for people. You would not have options to buy out people. At that point of time, Latin America cannot do all of those things, which means that it has to be protectionist, it has to protect its economy. But what is the harm in the short term, which is tremendously harmful, which they have not ever engaged with, right? Like their harm on the short term is that companies, especially Latin American countries, which do not have like big pockets to protect themselves from the fluctuating economy as a whole, necessarily fail with the global market. This is the most important thing in the debate. because this harms people. Like people lose jobs, people are not able to afford stuff, and at a point of which this is long term as well, because you cannot, like the company which has gone bankrupt or company which has lost tremendous amount of financial power cannot really just spring back up the moment this inflation is magically. I think at that point of paradigm they necessarily needed more engagement rather than saying that hey, this is symmetric and just fucking moved on from that argument, right? I think that is something which is tremendously harmful. But secondly, and much more importantly, right, the harms in terms of, even if they want to talk to long term, they have to protect in long term in a much better way by saying that why this subsidies harm in currently, right? They have two arguments for this. A, this is tremendous substantial amount of money which you keep on necessarily need to pay. One, we disagree with the fact. We think that 1% of the GDP can necessarily take you from like at least from next to 8 to 10 months. That is what predicted by Latin American economists already. I think at that point of paradigm, you're protecting yourself. But secondly, their argument, like I want to be very clear on this. Russia doesn't have infinite money with them, right? Which is to say that most amount of money which Russia makes in the global economy is by selling oil and natural gas. The moment you stop the pipes, it increases inflation in the world, sure, but also means that Russia is earning nothing, absolutely nothing. That is important, because if their argument is that this war becomes a stalemate, Russia needs to fucking fund the statement, which means that they will have to open the pipes at a certain point of time. This has to be in the next 6 to 8 months. But even if the war stops down, that's great for us as well. But also multitudes of alternatives in the form of China, USA, Qatar, everything else, right? But lastly, and more importantly, we tell you that the valuation of the currency itself, like even though the subsidies doesn't affect it, even if it stays low, that's okay, because it brings more foreign development investment out there. Their argument is like the GDP looks weak. I'm extremely unsure, right? If you spend your GDP to subsidies, I'm extremely unsure how that directly translates to your GDP is unstable. Like people invest in terms of growths of GDP and charts which tells them that the GDP's growth itself is stable. So even if we invest it, I'm not sure how the stable graph necessarily looks like a zigzag graph suddenly, magically. For all of those reasons, we mean we must protect the short term, because if you start protecting the long term, it's harmful. They have no counterfactual in which they protect the long term. Also, more importantly, if you don't protect the short term, there is actually no long term to protect for you. Could not be more proud to oppose.
Amazing. I thank Speaker for that speech, and I now call upon the leader of the affirmative team to conclude their case and the debate as a whole.
Hi, am I audible?
Yes, you are.
So I'll start my speech in 3, 2, 1. I think they just don't listen to our speech. Even from the first affirmative, we told you that our counter mechanism is to increase interest rates. I think they need to listen more. Even the process are there. We need to decrease spending so that circulation of money slowed down and people put their money on the banks because the interest is high. Just listen, going to the first clash, which can curb down inflation. Negative told us that price of fuel will go down, so it's a necessary temporary solution to ensure people can afford everyday necessity. On affirmative, we told you that people need to realize that inflation is happening, and so they know to not take mortgages. The way negative rebut this is so interesting. They say that no. People will see that when prices of onion go up on the supermarket, they will realize inflation still happen. It's a contradiction. If negative whip said that, then on their side of the house, that means your subsidy doesn't actually make prices become lower because inflation still happen and thus people can still see it. Trying to rebut us, they shoot their own case in the foot. Their biggest claim is making price affordable, but then say that people would still get the signal that inflation happened. They have zero benefits. On our side, it's more guaranteed because we prove to you that people will have a better decision making. For example, they wouldn't get the wrong signal and end up taking mortgages that they wouldn't be able to pay in the future because they were misled into believing that the economy is doing fine when it is not. Tipping point for winning this clash is the characterization why fuel's price are likely to be still high in the long term. We told you first war, but second OPEC plus, also limited resources. The reason why our characterization is superior is because we told you, for example, with war, it's becoming of a stalemate. Russia has its own allies giving its unlimited resources. Ukraine also should have run out of resources long time ago, but still got help, right? So that's why it's likely to still be going on. But even if you don't buy that characterization, we tell you that regardless of whether it will increase in the future, in a long term or not, we tell you that countries in Latin America have limited resources. They are usually economy running on debt already, putting 1% of your GDP is a bad decision making. Negative thought GDP is like a reserve that you have 99% of 99% to invest, right? But GDP is your gross production. That's not your profit. They still don't get how big that money is and how it will even put these countries into debt. Second clash, can the people survive in status quo? Negative told us that subsidizing fossil fuels means everything else is cheaper, which by the way was contradicted by their own whip. But another reason why affirmative won is because we told you that people will be able to survive in status quo because we give you characterization that slowing down the economy doesn't mean that we have zero economy. We characterize that people would still afford basic needs, but it's just that they wouldn't go to buy tertiary needs or things that they don't really need, or they wouldn't be brave enough to take up loans to make new businesses because they know that they need to save up money. That's therefore the tipping point is portrayal of likelihood. We're the one that give you more believable examples of what economy will looks like when interest goes up and people are less incentivized to want to take up loans. We're also the ones that give you analysis of people's decision making, how people see make decision making right now based on future probability. The way they rebut is by saying, oh, populist policy is not always bad. But listen, that this is not rebutting our main case. We're not saying populist is inherently bad, but we tell you it's bad because you make short term looks good, but long term became bad. Therefore, we should win because we prove that in the short term, the harm is manageable by people because they can survive, and in the future, it's much better on our side of the house. Third class, which is minors, about investors. Negative told you that investors will pull out when they don't, when you don't subsidize because they see that there is an inflation. We think this is wrong because the kind of things that investors value are actually long term, right? That's why it makes sense when we say that when the stability is only right now and it is artificial, that's when investors will pull out on negative side of the house, while on affirmative they will see that, oh, the government is doing something to guarantee a long term stability. That's why even if investors matter, they're on our side of the house to propose.
Awesome. I thank the speaker for that speech, and I thank both teams for an excellent debate. As usual, just virtual handshakes, and if you could leave the room, and we'll call. We can go back to the main room. Don't leave the call, and we'll come and get you when we're ready with an adjudication. All right, going into the adjudication, I'm gonna first I'm gonna tell you who won, and then the reason for that. I'm gonna save any general feedback for personal feedback. Just a couple of caveats about the adjudication. I think this debate was very broad. A lot of points were discussed. And so I might not mention a lot of the points or some of the points that were in the debate because I thought they weren't as important as the points that I've discussed. So if anyone has questions about anything in the debate that isn't mentioned in the adjudication, feel free to ask me after the adjudication or during personal feedback. All right, with that in mind, I'm going straight into it. Some examples of those things, for example, investment caused by weaker currencies, which I think is largely confusing in this debate, or rather symmetric, unclear as to how the significant change in the debate results in that, but also things around revolution and political problems that I think were brought up relatively late in the debate as well, weren't as important. The panel was unanimous. We gave this debate by a clear margin to the negative team, so congratulations to VIT and commiserations. So the adjudication and the reason for that is as follows. I'm going to divide it up into two, I guess, clashes, one about the short term and one about the long term. But as was evident in this debate, I think the short term analysis does flow into the long term analysis as well. So the first thing I want to discuss under the short term is whether there is a massive harm from not having the subsidy in place. We hear from side affirming that the subsidy is I guess, disproportionate, that you could not have that subsidy and instead kind of do the opposite, which is to restrict the amount of money in the economy by having higher interest rates, etc. And that is not going to tank the economy, which is going to slow it down a little bit, which means that consumers make more rational decisions because of that signaling. So they're less likely to spend on luxury, less likely to take out mortgages or loans because they know that there is inflation. In terms of that harm calculus and the quantum of harm there, I think how side negative manages to prove to us that there is a significant harm that requires the subsidy, even in the short term, not considering the long term, is a lot of analysis around the specific industries and economies of countries in Latin America. So I think there's been a lot of time to connect fossil fuels and just how the infrastructure of the economy works and why alternatives don't necessarily exist. And because of that, it shows that a lot of people depend on it. So the I guess shift in on the affirmative world where they don't have that subsidy isn't just not spending on luxuries, but a lot of harms that flow down from fossil fuels being more expensive that might result in the most vulnerable people and poorer individuals who are no longer making decisions about luxury, about being laid off from their jobs because the businesses costs have gone up or not be able to afford basic necessities. So I think that shift and that characterization of what Latin American countries look like and the dependency on fossil fuels shows to us that there is a significant harm. So we should care about that short term. It also does a couple of other things in terms of building that world, where I think there's a point brought up by side affirming about how consumers or how individual citizens will react to the subsidy and whether there might be an element of hoarding. And I think the idea that a lot of that oil is necessary and therefore will be used also undermines or mitigates to a certain extent how many people will be able to hoard and how much of that is likely to harm people. How much of that is likely to undermine the subsidy in and of itself. So at that point there, I think side negative shows a very significant harm of not reacting in the short term that side affirming has to then weigh up against any future long-term harms that they bring to you. But this is the strategy that side affirmative goes to. So at the point after we've discussed the short-term things, side negative has proven a significant harm to vulnerable people. Side affirming then has a burden to show that there is a long-term harm here. So how does that happen in this debate? The first thing that side affirming does in terms of attacking the idea of solving this problem of cost of living is to say that this is not sustainable. It's spending a lot of money on something that isn't going to be solved by this. It's just a band-aid solution. And therefore, if the cost of living goes, it continues for a long time and fossil fuel prices don't reduce, that is a waste. And then those harms that side negative are trying to avoid would happen anyway, but you wouldn't have that money as a buffer to do other things. So the debate, the clash there then becomes about how short term is the fuel crisis, and whether you would be forced to either keep doing this in an unsustainable way or you give up at some point and the harms occur then. So the idea on the long term, how long term the cost of fuel comes down to a couple of things. So there's a big clash on the war in Ukraine and how far that is likely to go. At that point, it's very unclear as to the balance of power there, but I think side negative is slightly ahead on explaining why Russia is unlikely to continue because they're reliant on the money they get from oil. We hear responses down the line from side affirming, particularly at Reply, kind of using the same analysis that we hear from side negative in terms of Russia having allies, but I think that the response comes out relatively late, but also needs to be built up a little bit more. But I think most strong in terms of building that world up from side negative, we hear that if that does continue for a long time, then there's obviously a need to find other sources, and there are other sources. So there's the US, there's the Middle East, and how those alternatives will adjust for that if the price of oil is really high. And I think there is a preemptive point made by side affirming about how OPEC countries will manipulate oil and that they're doing it right now. But I think the analysis from side negative shows that if the price of oil is pretty high, then there's a lot of money to be made there. So alternatives are likely to pop up, which means that after that point and after that clash, it's not clear to us as adjudicators whether this is going to be a significantly long-term problem that results in the kind of unsustainable subsidy that is mentioned by side affirmative. So I think on that point, side negative is ahead in showing that they actually solve a short-term problem that they might not need to continue putting that subsidy in place. However, side affirming says there are other harms from doing so. So the first is that people make bad decisions because they are not scared of this anymore, and point out a small tension in responses from side negative, given that the harm still happening, if the harm doesn't happen to them in their world, because they're subsidizing fuel, so therefore they are not incurring that massive harm that they have characterized that would happen on side affirming, then there wouldn't be caution, and people will make those bad decisions. A couple of problems, I think, with that analysis and with that pointing out intention. The first is that I think side negative does some work to show that there are other ways that you could find out about inflation and be worried about it, not necessarily through the price signaling of goods on the shelf, but also, as I've already mentioned, the characterization shift that side negative did to show the scale of harm means that on side affirming, what that does in terms of evaluating this point for me is that inside affirming's world, there will be a very big change that would harm a lot of people, and inside negative's world, I'm convinced that they're able to minimize that harm and mitigate that harm, which is a benefit for them, but not to the extent that there is no signaling that there's inflation, coupled with all the other things about just how inflation is just a big topic and people know about it, which means that I'm convinced that people aren't going to be very, very complacent, but yes, maybe they are more scared and are more likely to save as opposed to spend on side affirmative's world. But not to the extent that I think that there is that the government is misleading them to a certain extent that results in specific harms from not having this policy in place. However, the question becomes then, even if this is not an unsustainable use of GDP in order to stop the cost of living crisis from fuel, it does not solve inflation. I think side affirming is very clear about that, how that does not solve inflation, and they have particular alternatives in order to solve inflation. So there is a path here for side affirming to say, yes, you solve a short-term problem, it's not unsustainable, but inflation still happens. What we can do is take a short-term hit and get a long-term better better economy because we solve inflation. The way that side affirming wants to solve that inflation problem is by increasing interest rates using monetary policy. There's a lot of, I guess, doubt raised by side negative of how effective that will be done and how well that will be done, pointing to historical patterns by Latin American countries. I think that analysis could have been a little bit more specific to the context, and maybe it interacts a little bit with protests and with populism and that kind of thing. But I think what is broadly the problem with the monetary policy point is the analysis we hear from side negative, how this is likely to be very long term. And the strategy by side negative that was very effective in this debate is to show that if you do harm the economy to the extent that I've already discussed in the characterization of how much the economy actually depends on fuel, that there wouldn't be that long term, even if you can solve inflation there. So what they do bring in is bringing in even a worse harm to the economy than inflation, which is like, I guess, it's stagflation, which is like a recessionary element, even with that inflation. And I don't think at the end of this debate, either team solves inflation. What does side negative tell me? Side negative tells me that, again, stemming from the characterization of how dependent these economies are on fuel, that there actually is going to be a big cost more than just, a slight reshuffling of money and saving and not spending on luxuries, but there'll be a lot of jobs lost, a lot of businesses that close, and that kind of justifies the significant subsidy of fuel in order to save as many businesses as possible, but also that then results in a worse economy and worse trust in the market, given higher interest rates. And so therefore you're unable to jumpstart the economy again once you've destroyed it to that level. So I think that framing was very useful for side negative, because that shows them that you aren't able, even if you solve inflation by people saving, to jumpstart any sort of economy, and you fall into a recessionary cycle there, which also means that you're unable to do things as the government anyway. And that gets me to the final clash in this point that I want to discuss, which is this idea about the long-term stability of debt ratios and the GDP. So we hear that spending a lot of money right now is really harmful, and side affirming's claim is that this will be unsustainable and continue into the future, and therefore a lot of money will be spent on it. I've already discussed how side negative convinces us it's not going to be so long that there are alternatives. But what side negative does as well is show that the same recessionary outcomes and the fact that you lose jobs and investment in the country means that you're unable to you will also then suffer a big hit to your market confidence and GDP, which will result in very similar outcomes in your ability to pay back debt. So your need to take on more loans, those kinds of things. So at the end of that point, I'm convinced, firstly, that there is a short-term harm that side negative can prevent, and that is important given if there is no long-term harm. But I think side negative not only shows that there isn't necessarily a long-term harm that's unique to their side by using these fuel subsidies, by pointing out that it's unlikely to solve in the future if you harm the economy so much, but I think slightly flip this point to show that it's actually far worse in the long term if you create a recessionary cycle alongside the inflationary cycle that might harm way more people in the long term. And that's why we thought that the negative team won this debate. Thank you.